Hey everyone, I'm very happy to have you here in this AutoRabbit webinar, Clean Code Real DevOps. My name is Pablo Gonzalez. I'm a Director of Product Management and Research at AutoRabbit. I'm also the author of the book Clean Apex Code, which I think most of you are familiar with, and I've been in the Salesforce space for almost 14 years. So let's get started. We're going to talk about why real DevOps needs clean code. I assume most people know about the concept of continuous integration and how it is a core tenet of DevOps. But basically, continuous integration means that you have to ensure your changes don't break other developers' changes, and that other developers' changes don't break your own changes. And this is meant to be executed in real time. That's the theory, that somehow you're testing these changes in combination with other people's changes in real time, not after a sprint. So how it's supposed to work is that you deploy your changes, your in-progress changes, even if they're not complete, to a shared environment like an integration sandbox. Then you run a test. You ensure that your feature works in parallel to other people's changes. You also make sure that their features work, meaning that you don't break any tests. And then basically you repeat this multiple times a day. Now, for this to be possible, your tests have to run really fast, because if your tests take 45 minutes to run, then of course no one's going to want to deploy changes multiple times a day and wait 45 minutes for a simple change, especially if everyone else is doing the same. Again, the theory of continuous integration is that everyone is doing this, so everyone's changes are being continuously integrated with everyone else's changes. But most Salesforce tests actually take a very long time to run, and so continuous integration is simply impossible for most teams. Now, there are really three enablers to continuous integration, or in this case, to running tests really fast. First is you need clean code, right? So you need good code quality, you need your methods to be descriptive, to be short, you need a good balance between coupling and cohesion, etc. Second is you need to learn how to mock the Salesforce database. This is the real thing. If you can mock the Salesforce database in your test, you can reduce text execution time by more than 50%. However, how to do this is actually really hard, and there's a whole chapter dedicated to that on my book. But the other thing is modular design, right? How do you structure your code in a way that you know where one code ends or starts and another one ends? How do you draw boundaries between the different modules of your code? If you have modular design, then it's easier to know how to mock the Salesforce database, which again makes it easier for your tests to run fast and practice real continuous integration. So I realized that, okay, that's actually a lot, right? So you need clean code, you need to learn how to mock the Salesforce database, but you also need to learn about modular design. So these are not technological problems. This is a knowledge gap. And so, tools like AutoRabbit are really good at automating almost everything that can be automated on a continuous integration flow or continuous delivery. However, as long as we have the knowledge gap on how to mock the Salesforce database and how to have modular code that enables our tests to run faster, we won't be able to practice real continuous integration. So in essence, it's a knowledge gap. It's not a technological gap. We need to learn how to do this if we want to practice real continuous integration. And that's why I wrote the book, Clean Apex Code. It may not be obvious that I wrote it with the end goal of enabling people to practice real DevOps. So it's not about the code itself. It's kind of a means to an end, and the end is get good at modular software design and at mocking dependencies and boundaries like the Salesforce database, so that you can practice real continuous integration and so that you can do real DevOps. That's why the webinar is called Real DevOps Needs Clean Code. And so that was kind of the motivation for the book. Now, that's a lot of stuff, and in this webinar I cannot cover everything. So I'm just going to talk about modular design, and one way to adopt modular design is to think about different principles that can be used to think about boundaries and where to put logic in different places. So as I was writing the book, I realized towards the end that I needed some kind of framework to bring all the concepts together, not in a way for people to follow kind of recipes, but in a way that allows people to remember certain principles, certain thinking principles or patterns for enabling modular design. And so I came up with this idea of the Apex Well Architect framework, which now has a whole website called AWAF, that stands for Apex Well Architected Framework. And so this is the companion site for the book. It's also the last chapter of the book. And it's basically an alternative to FFlib. So if you're familiar with FFlib, it is a library for Apex Enterprise Patterns. And I decided to make it an alternative because that's the only library that talks about kind of separation of concerns and things like that. But I really don't agree with their approach to it. And so I thought, okay, well, it's easier for people to consume things if they think about it as an alternative to something else, right? And so my goal is to enable people to think better about modularity, boundaries, and business logic in a way that doesn't really force you to do things a certain way. And again, this is just one of the 3 core tenets that should help you get real continuous integration. All right, so let's talk a little bit about Financial Force Library, also known as FFlib or Apex Enterprise Patterns. So this was created by Andrew Fawcett at Financial Force, and I've always been very transparent that we owe Andrew our gratitude for creating this amazing framework, even though I think there's a lot of limitations to it, but clearly he pushed the ecosystem forward in a way that most people just can't, and so we owe him a lot for that. And it is inspired by the Patterns of Enterprise Application Architecture book by Martin Fowler, which is a book from the early 2000s, I think. And again, it aims to bring modular design to Apex by introducing the concept of layers. So there are 3 layers. There's a domain layer, which is meant to handle object-specific logic. So you have, let's say, an account domain layer where you handle validations, triggers, and just account-related logic. Then you have the service layer, which is meant to expose kind of APIs, like higher-level business processes that may interact with different objects. And then you have a selector layer that encapsulates all so-called queries, supposedly to achieve consistent data retrieval. I'll talk more about that in a moment. Now, as I said, great framework, but I think where it falls short is that it really encourages people to just follow the framework and don't think, right? And I realize some people find that attractive, like, okay, I don't need to think. I just need to put this stuff on the service class or put this query on the selector. But then it means we're not learning. We're taking a shortcut using someone else's opinion of the world, and we're not really growing. We're not really exercising our software engineering mindset. It also misrepresents separation of concerns as a binary concept. And what that means is if you actually read the documentation on Trailhead about this framework, it literally says, here are the scenarios where you don't need separation of concerns. And so separation of concerns is not something that exists or doesn't exist. It's not a thing that is there or not there. It's a spectrum. And really, the real term for it is modularity, is how things are coupled, which is coupling, and how related things are close together, which is cohesion. So both coupling and cohesion are spectrums. You can have high cohesion, which is good. You can have high coupling, which can sometimes be a little not great, and you can have low coupling. But the idea that you could have no separation of concerns at all and make that a conscious choice to me is just simply not reasonable. And so I worry that people will just, again, blindly think about it like, oh, I don't need to implement separation of concerns because this is a short or simple project. And it doesn't work like that. And, well, as I said, it basically makes you not think, right? You want to put a new method? Okay, put it on the service layer because that's what the pattern says. Do you want to create a new query? Okay, put it on the selector class. It doesn't really encourage you to think, should this logic be here because there's other logic that is closely related and I want to increase cohesion? Or should this logic be in a different class because I want it to be a bit more separated to create a boundary, which is, again, modularity. So it basically discourages people to think, and it just encourages them to do what the framework says. Now, there are also some other concerns, like, I think it works great on a managed package environment, and I think actually that's where the framework originated when building Financial Force. So if you have a managed package that has limited functionality, let's say with the opportunity object, then I think it makes sense for you to have like a service class and domain class where you just throw all the logic related to the opportunity because it's finite in scope. But if you're working at an enterprise, which is kind of the reality for most Salesforce teams, the opportunity object, for example, is not usually owned by one entity or by one business unit. The customization on that object may be owned by marketing, sales, even customer support, and you cannot just throw all that logic into a service class because then you're going to have a lot of merge conflicts. You're going to have, one class that has 10 different responsibilities. And so I think, again, it works well in a managed package context, and that's just not the reality for most people. I also have concerns about selectors, and I will talk about that later. But I think overall the framework is over-engineered for most Salesforce orgs. And again, it's not progressive. It's not something that you can start small and then grow. It's basically a lot of interfaces to implement, a lot of different things to know. And again, this was based on Martin Fowler's kind of work on Java enterprise applications. But this was, more than 15 years ago. And Martin Fowler wasn't working on the Salesforce space in 2025 when we have Flow, Apex, validation rules, and now Agentforce. If he had been working on this, I guarantee you he would have written completely different patterns. And so the idea is that the patterns were good for what Martin Fowler was doing at the time in the technology he was working on, but I don't think they apply one-to-one to Salesforce development. All right, that's a lot of complaining. As I said, I really thank Andrew Fawcett for creating the framework because it brought engineering practices to the ecosystem at a time where it was really needed. And so this is not meant to be like a critique to himself or his work. It's more just my opinion on why this framework falls short. All right, so what comes after that is AWAF, which is the Apex Well-Architected Framework. So what I propose is that it's not a one-size-fits-all framework. It's not a framework that will tell you, okay, put this here because the framework says that, or just don't think and put this code in this class. It's really about principles, not an implementation. And so the way I describe it is that, two Salesforce orgs using Financial Force library will look the same. They will both have service class, domain class, and selector. And two orgs using AWAF would look completely different, but they would feel the same. And I know that sounds a bit kind of philosophical and fluffy, but I really mean it. I really mean that you could be a developer working in an org that adopts AWAF, and you kind of get a feel for the code base where you feel, okay, I see things are clearly delineated. There's responsibilities in this class that completely end, and the processing moves to another class that has a different responsibility. There's a good balance between coupling and cohesion, and a few other practices, because I do have some specific practices that I'll talk about later. And you may move to another org, and that org could be completely different, but it just feels the same. right? Because it follows the same principles. And again, maybe you're tired of hearing this, but it has a strong emphasis on modularity, coupling, and cohesion. And so I think this is better because then rather than just saying, just put the code here, you can adopt the principles to whatever meets your requirements at that point in time. So if you're a smaller org, you may decide to implement the principles in one way. If you're a much larger org, you may want to implement them in a different way. But the benefit is the same because the underlying principle is the same. Also, I think as a developer, I think it's nice if you create like a library and thousands of people use it. I admit that if I had done that, right? Like if there was an AWAF library and everyone was using it, of course it would feel nice and, it's a nice ego boost and whatever, but it's just not future proof, like you cannot maintain a library forever. Technology changes, people's priority changes, and then it would basically suffer from the same thing that FFlib suffers today. Somebody else would come in 10 years and say, hey, AWAF doesn't work because this and that, and it's an outdated library. And I didn't really want to do it. I wanted to come up with something that people can adopt today and in 10 years, and that basically cannot be disrupted because it's based on principles, not specific implementations of those principles. And it does encourage you to actually think, right? How should I model this thing? Where should I put this business logic? Is this business logic or is this non-business logic? Maybe more like infrastructure logic. And so you'll see that it's more about how you think and less about where you put things. All right, that said, there are some specific practices to the framework. It's not all that philosophical. And so the first practice is that, if you're following AWAF, you should use Salesforce DX folders instead of huge service classes. So what I have here on the screen is on the left, there's the typical case service, which is, what Financial Force library recommends, where you have one big class where all the APIs and all the, functionality for the case object goes there. And again, I think this makes sense if it's a managed package, if it's limited functionality. But if it's a big org with different business units and many different use cases, I don't think that makes sense. So what I suggest instead is that you use SFDX folders, as you can see on the right side of the screen here, to segregate things or separate things into different use cases or business units. So for example, you may have a case closure folder, and inside that case closure folder, you may have a couple of Apex classes, maybe a few Lightning Web components, maybe a page layout, maybe a record type. You put everything that relates to that use case or that business unit into that folder, and that increases cohesion because things that are related are actually closely together. And this also allows you to have smaller classes because rather than having a case service where everything is there, you have just some classes related to case closure. And so what we need to realize here is that the idea of a service class where all the functionality is thrown together made sense 10 years ago when we didn't have SFDX folders, because having everything in the same class does increase cohesion because everything is there. But there was no other way. Now there's a better way, which is you can use folders to group things that are related together. And that's a better way to achieve cohesion than throwing everything into a gigantic class. And so the core idea here is that if you want to adopt the AWAF framework, you have to make a conscious effort to always be thinking, how can I move things around? How can I put this, how can I make this feature or this use case more visible in my SFDX repository, right? What folders could I create? What structure could I have to make sure that when I look at it, I can immediately tell where things are? All right, so that's one of the principles. Now, one of the critiques that I have with FFlib is I never really understood where to place business logic. Like, if you look at the service class versus the domain class, basically you have an example here. They're kind of the same. Like the explanation that the framework provides on when to put logic in service versus domain class, to me is entirely artificial. Like, and the classes are really the same. The only difference is the name. So if you have case service, suddenly it's a service class. If you just call it cases, then suddenly it's a domain class. But really, let's say if you have functionality that relates to closing cases, why should that be on the service versus the domain? Or why does it need to be on the domain and not on the service? If it's that important to the business, then why should it not be on? The thing is that they're, to me, they're kind of artificial concerns or separations. And so at the heart of this critique is that there's no clear guidance on where to put business logic. So I have a new requirement. Where do I put that? Should I put it on a service class? Should I put it on a domain class? Should I put it on a class that is dedicated to that business requirement? Should I put it on the trigger handler itself? There's no guidance on this. And that's where I struggle. And I think more important than figuring out, service versus domain, more important would be for us to understand what is business logic, what is not business logic. And that way we can make better decisions of where that should go. So what is business logic? Well, first, what is not business logic is, things like retrying transactions or HTTP callouts, logic related to, bypassing triggers if you don't have some custom metadata or something like that. Or also any logic that you may have to batch different DML operations or checking for governor limits and executing something asynchronous. None of that is business logic. And I'm not saying that it's not important. It's 100% important, but it's just not business logic. So what business logic is, literally what the business will tell you. Hey, when an opportunity is closed, we should have a contract. A case should be escalated if it's high priority after 2 hours. That's the real business logic. And so we should try to make an effort to separate these two whenever possible. So one way to do this, and I'm not saying this is the only way or even the best way, is to basically create or have this concept of core classes where the core is really the pure business logic. Clearly, this is an oversimplified example, and in the book I go into a lot more detail about this. But here's the idea, right? If the business requirement says, hey, when an opportunity is close won, we should create a contract. If you look at this class is almost plain English. This is as close as you'll ever get to the actual requirement. There's no mention of DML operations. There's no mention of asynchronous processing. No mention of, batching DML operations or retrying or debug logs or anything like that. Literally says, hey, if the stage is close won, we should create a contract and we model that as a decision. Otherwise, we shouldn't do anything. Again, simplified example, you could have many more different types of decisions, or it could be a simple, Boolean true or false. But the point is that this is the pure business logic. And then you have infrastructure logic, which kind of wraps around it, which will do actual DML operations, retrying, logging, and all that. And so the idea here is that we should try to model business logic from the inside out, rather than starting to think about, trigger context variables and trigger that new versus trigger that old and querying and all that. Can we model the business logic in a way that is as close to the business requirement? We call that the core, lives inside. And then we start wrapping it up with more infrastructure concerns. And so where do you put this? Well, you put it in an SFDX folder related to that use case or to that feature or to that business unit. Again, this is not a silver bullet, but I think this distinction between business logic and non-business logic is more useful than just saying, put this on the service class because my framework says so. Now, clearly we still need domain classes to some extent, because you may have a lot of functionality related to a specific object, and so I do agree with the concept in general of a domain class. However, again, I think that if you just have a domain class for one object, it can basically become a God class. And so if you see the example here, it's only an example, but you have like, before insert and handle after insert, and they apply discounts and sync to ERP and process close one. And so again, it becomes kind of like a catch-all place where you just put all the logic related to the opportunity object, and that'll grow to ridiculous size. And you're going to have merge conflicts. You're going to have issues when you have to remove something from the sprint, because then it's going to affect someone else's work that's already in progress. And so what I think it's actually better is to organize logic based on business relevant state. So what does that mean? Well, I'm sure most of you have record types. And so if you use record types, a lot of your Apex code is going to be checking for that record type, right? So if you see the red square here, this is incredibly common to see in Apex. If the record type is this, then do that. If it's that, then do something else. And so if you have a lot of these if conditions in your code, then why not model that as a small domain, right? So you could think of partnership opportunities as a domain or as a subdomain of the opportunity, and the same with the customer opportunities. And most likely those are owned by different business units, right? You may have the partnerships team and you may have the customer success team, which they own the different implementations of those opportunities. So then what I propose is that instead of doing these checks all the time, like these if conditions, you create a class that represents that relevant state. In this case, you could have a class called partnership opportunities and another class called customer opportunities. And so to this class, you just pass a list of opportunities, and the class itself is responsible for filtering the opportunities that do not meet the requirement or the conditions. In this case, that the record type is partnership. But this is a lot cleaner, and it also aligns with the single responsibility principle. And it also makes our code more modular, right? And so if we have code that interact with partnership opportunities and customer opportunities, we could even mock those classes during our tests, right? If we have a dedicated class to partnership opportunities, we could mock the notify new owner method in a test so that we can test it in combination of other classes. You cannot do that if you have all this stuff as huge methods inside of one domain class. And this is one example of how I think that AWeB encourages modularity by having smaller classes that represent different things, and that enables easier mocking in your tests. And as I said, that enables more real continuous integration. Now let's talk about selector classes, because that's a big part of the fflib library. And so again, selector classes like domain classes can quickly become a God class. You just put all your queries there. And one of the challenges of selector classes is that they basically create inertia for you to create very special purpose methods. So if you have a method called query by ID and then query by industry, then why not query by name and then query by address? Or then you're going to start doing query by these fields or query with these other fields. And so it creates inertia for you to create more special single purpose methods that probably satisfy one or two requirements. And so this class can easily grow to have hundreds of methods, each doing just a small variation of a different query. And the argument that the maintainers of the library use is that, well, if your queries are consistent, then all the objects that come back from those queries have the same shape. And so let's imagine that we say every time we get an opportunity from a query, we have to have the name. So if you look at the first example here, if you don't query the name and then you try to reference that name, you're going to get a SOQL exception. And so the literature of fflib says that this is the use case for selectors, that to avoid this problem, you centralize all your queries and you ensure that every time you get an opportunity, you get the name back or whatever other field. And the argument is that then you ensure that they come back with the same shape. But really, in my opinion, to fix this error, you just add the field there and that's it. Like, it takes literally 2 seconds to add that query there and move on, versus having a lot of, different variations of the same query in a selector class. And also the other thing is that, again, a selector class is then prone to merge conflicts because everyone is working on the same class, everyone is adding different queries, and you end up with the same problems of a gigantic class. So what I propose instead is that we use general purpose query builders. So this is one example of one of the many query builders that exist in the ecosystem. This is not mine, so I have no affiliation to it. But if you really want to have some way to do better SQL queries, maybe like to mock the database or different things, something that is general purpose is a lot easier to use. So it has the same benefits in the sense that because it's an abstraction on top of SQL, you can mock this in a test. So in fact, this library here actually has a built-in functionality to mock this during a test, which is the same benefit that you would get from a selector, but you don't get all the baggage from it. And so a general purpose query builder provides a lot more value to the overall code base, because it still provides some level of consistency, it still provides mocking, but it doesn't require developers to be always editing that class to add new queries and dealing with merge conflicts and all that. Now, those were just a few of the highlights of AWAF. There's actually a lot more. It's just that it's a larger framework. There's some stuff around feature flags, how do you deploy code without actually making it available to end users. There are much deeper discussions around modeling business logic, and also how do you make a distinction between trigger logic and business logic, because sometimes those two are very much related. And so this webinar wasn't meant to be like an explanation of the entire framework, but simply kind of an overview for us to start thinking a bit more about modularity. If you want to learn more, then obviously the book has all the information. It's kind of the source of truth for everything that I said here. But if you're not ready to commit for buying a book, then I highly recommend you check the Apex Well Architected site that has the entire framework in way more detail than I explained here. And it also has summaries of every chapter of the book as guiding principles for the framework. So that's basically it. I'm happy to answer any questions that you may have. So let's see. There is a question here by Krishna about so I'm not sure I understand your question, Chris, and you may want to rephrase that if you don't mind. But I understand that you're saying that if you try to follow PMD, sometimes it may result in code that is hard to read. So maybe if you give me an example of that, I'm happy to give you my answer as to what the right balance is. Rosalind, you have a question there about what resources would I suggest to get more background or experience with mocking. Honestly, my book, and I don't mean that in a way of, like just buy the book. I mean that in the sense that I was actually never satisfied with any of the resources out there in the ecosystem. First of all, there are very few. Very few people talk about mocking the database. And those who do assume that you're kind of an expert in object-oriented programming and some very advanced design patterns. And so if you're already an expert, then yeah, mocking a database is a thing that you can learn in a day. But I think most of us are not like that. And I think it's very common for Salesforce developers to not have a background in object-oriented programming. So the second half of my book uh, builds up to that. There's a chapter on object-oriented programming to kind of make sure that we're on the same page as to what's an interface, what's an abstract class, what's inheritance. And then it starts talking about some design principles like the single responsibility principle. It eventually moves to modularity. And then it has a chapter on dependency injection. And then finally, I explain mocking. So you need all those stuff. You need good understanding of object-oriented programming, interfaces, dependency injection, and all that before you can even make sense of the concept of mocking the Salesforce database. So when I wrote the book, or that part, I was kind of writing it for myself. Like if I didn't know how to mock the Salesforce database, what are the things that I would need to learn and in what order? So shameless plug, but I think the book is probably the best explanation you can find in a logical order on how to get there. And I just saw your comment that you said aside from the book. So aside from the book, there is nothing else. The book is probably the best way that I know will teach you how to mock the Salesforce database. Christian said, how would you start a migration from FFlib to the Apex Full Architecture Framework? That's a great question. In the book, I do say that I believe both frameworks can coexist. And see, the thing is that AWAF there's no library, there's no source code that you can download and say, okay, we're going to migrate our service class from FFlib to AWAF. What would it look like is if you're using FFlib and you have a service class, then you will have to start looking at it and see, okay, how can we start splitting responsibilities in this class, right? Are there any logical places where we can say, these 5 methods, they all seem to be doing something similar or related to the same concern? Can we take that out as a separate class and call it whatever it should be called? And can we find where to put that in the SFDX repository? What's the best place for that to be? Maybe it's close to some flows that are related to it. Maybe it's close to some fields or some objects. And so that's what a migration would kind of look like. But I think, as I said, they can coexist. You could also have one big domain class, and then you start working on a new custom object, and you can say, okay, from now on, I'm not going to create a domain class for this object. I'm going to create state relevant classes. So one class per record type or one class per different variation of that object. And hopefully that answers the question. Okay, let me just read the question here from Krishna. Instead of our coding classes, yeah, so some of the best practices do result in. So it's funny because Krishna, you just reminded me of a question that I asked on Stack Overflow like 6 years ago when I was reading the book Clean Code, the original Clean Code book from Robert C. Martin. And a lot of the code that he produces actually results in a lot more code. So sometimes clean code results in an explosion of classes because people take these concepts to an extreme, right? People say, okay, single responsibility. So one class for this, one class for that. And you end up with 50 classes for a thing that could easily be like a 45 lines method. And so to your point, yes, sometimes, there'll be best practices such as having all the constants in one, at the top of the class and have this and that. And they result in more code. And more code is harder to read, is a bigger surface area for bugs. So I don't know that I have a specific answer to that other than, again, I'm not trying to say read the book, but maybe read the book because there is a specific section where I do explain that I believe it's okay to let go of some of these design principles because they just result in a lot more code. And so I would prefer to see a method of 40 lines than that method being split in 3 classes that have single responsibility. And so as an industry, we have been afraid of longer methods, and methods should be short and they should do just one thing. But we rarely think about cohesion. If you have a method that is this long, all the stuff it's there. The moment you split it in 3 classes, now you need to jump back and forth between all the 3 classes to understand that bit of logic. So it may not answer your question. I don't have a direct answer, but just know that I agree that sometimes best practices can result in a lot more code. There is a question, Ian, about the book. Just send me a message on LinkedIn afterwards, and I can help you with that. There's a question here about how to follow, what recommendation about following the same principles with flow. It's a great question. I think the same principles apply, though it may be a bit harder to do with flow. So, for example, that's a good question. Like, you may have flows, especially record trigger flows, are kind of similar to triggers or workflow rules. And so if you have 5 flows that they all trigger on some condition plus the record type being X, right? So if the account is created and the record type is X, or if account is edited and whatever, and the record type is X, and if all those have that check, if the record type is X, then can we somehow bring them together? I'm not saying that's the correct answer. I'm only thinking out loud. Can we bring them together into a bigger flow called X accounts, right? So this flow is responsible for accounts of this record type. And you could delegate to other smaller flows, but at least make that the entry point. And again, use SFDX folders to put them together, right? If they're all related to that X record type, then figure out who owns that record type from a business point of view. Maybe it's the marketing department or sales engineering or something like that. Create a folder for them in the SFDX hierarchy and put all those flows in the same place so that at least you can visualize that they're separate, but they're related. But I agree in general that there isn't an equivalent framework for flow. So whoever's watching this session, maybe you should come up with a flow architected framework. Anyway, there's another question about what do I recommend to propose, or what do I propose to speed up development process? Am I recommending to split the code into separate packages inside the project? No. Well, to speed up the process of development, I hope you're using AI. And like, I'm a huge fan of AI-assisted programming. And I know it's not the same for Apex, unfortunately. For Apex, it's not that great as it is for other languages. But like, I'm full on AI. And I know it's kind of weird because it's like, I'm the guy who wrote the book and whatever. So shouldn't I be more about, design patterns and all that stuff? Because if you see like kind of on the internet, most people talk about AI programming being bad, full of codes, full of insecure code and stuff like that. And there are some truths to that. But I'll give you my perspective. I have been writing code for, I don't know, like 10 years. And I've written so much code that when I can see that AI can write code for me, I'm like, hell yeah, I deserve this because I need a break. How much code can you write, your whole life? And really, to me, what's more important that many people undervalue is the correctness of the business requirement. You may spend 2 weeks crafting a perfect looking code, and then when you deploy it, the business realizes that it's the wrong requirement, it's the wrong abstraction. They didn't fully understand what they wanted. And so what was the point? What was the point of spending all that, 2 weeks with clean names and perfectly crafted methods and all that if in the end the business doesn't get the value that they need? So long answer, I like using AI programming a lot because it can help me write code a lot faster, getting in front of people faster, and then validate. Is this what you wanted? Does this meet that requirement? If people say no, that's not it, it's not really what we needed, okay, then no problem, throw it away and do it again. It didn't take 2 weeks, now it takes 2 days with something like GitHub Copilot or Cursor. So I strongly recommend that everyone here uses some AI programming tool for speeding up development. Breaking down the org into multiple packages is a whole different discussion. I think, and I don't think we're ready for that as an industry. I think a middle step is to break down the repo into different folders. Like I said, okay, one folder per business unit or different use cases and things like that. If you do that for a couple of years, I'm sure eventually you will find some way to maybe take certain part of that and make it a separate package. But if you're not even doing that, then forget about splitting the org packages. It's just, we're not there. All right, so I don't have any, so there's a question there about anything related to batch Apex. No, I don't have anything like that. So one of the things about the book is that the book is very much about software design rather than Apex specific patterns. And so I do assume that people reading the book have at least 3 years of Salesforce experience or like Apex programming. So I don't really explain stuff like batch Apex or patterns for, aggregating DML exceptions or stuff like that, just because I feel like you can find that anywhere these days. There's so many blog posts about that. And the knowledge gap that I mentioned earlier is real software design, modularity, coupling, cohesion, boundaries. That's where the gap is. So unfortunately, no, there's very little stuff about purely Apex stuff. The closest to that is actually, can't remember what chapter it is, but I do have the book here. I think it's chapter 5 that actually talks about, it's chapter 7, talks about cascading failures in trigger boundaries. So it does talk a little bit about using asynchronous processing to avoid a trigger failure to cascade and, basically pass the exception through all the stack trace. And so I do cover a little bit of asynchronous processing in the context of how to avoid a cascading failure. And so I naturally do mention batch Apex, but other than that, no, there's no specific patterns for that. Someone's saying, is there anything that you should know before reading the book? Yes, like I said, I expect you to know Apex. Some people have challenged me on that and say, well, actually, no, even beginners can benefit from it. And that may be true. The thing is that when I wrote the book, a lot of people were telling me that I shouldn't write the book. I know that's kind of weird, but for some reason, people love telling you what you should do with your life. And a lot of people were telling me that, oh, you shouldn't write it because there's already a bunch of books on software design and there's clean code and there's so much blogs about it. And so when I wrote it, I'm like, okay, I'm not going to rewrite everything that's already been written. They're right. There's a lot of resources out there. So how can I put a perspective to Apex? And how can I challenge some of those principles, not just for challenging's sake, but because I truly believe that not all of them are applicable to Apex in the same way. So some of the arguments of the book may not make sense to you if you're new to programming. You do need to have some experience for you to be like, oh, yes, I understand what he's saying. So I recommend that you already know Apex, that you have been developing in Apex for at least 2 years. So yeah, that's a recommendation. There's a question there about any suggestions about getting buy-in from larger team to adhere to AWAF principles. Good question. Well, you can send them a recording to this webinar. That would be one thing. Maybe send them to the AWAF website as well so that they can read the principles themselves. And, I think, Devin, maybe don't make it a big deal, right? Because the moment you make it a big deal with people, then people are like, oh, we don't want to change everything. If you have a pull request process, then you yourself, Devin, you can start injecting your own little opinions about that PR process related to AWAF. Like, hey, maybe this class is too big. Can we put this in a smaller class? Or hey, I noticed that we didn't put this in an SFDX folder that may make it clear. Or hey, I noticed that these 4 metadata, so like a class, 2 fields, and 1 validation rule, I noticed they're all related to the same Jira ticket. Can we put them in the same folder, right? So I think if you start kind of hinting at that direction, it may be easier than you just telling your team, hey, we should follow AWAF because it's great, or something like that. Well, there's a lot of questions. That's great. It's a great problem to have. There's another question from Rosalind. How do I feel about using Apex actions in flows as a way to increase modularity? I think that it's a great use case. I've done it in the past where in one of my previous jobs, we had a flow that was very complex, and there was one part that was more complex than everything else. And we decided to take that bit out of the flow and put it in Apex. So especially around doing some complex logic with maps, or very strange iterations over lists or things like that, like deduplicating stuff. I personally feel that sometimes that stuff is a lot more intuitive in Apex. So I definitely support the idea of using Apex actions. And to your point, actually, I find it interesting that you say to increase modularity, because I don't think most people would say that, but I love it. The point being is that in the book, in the chapter about modularity, I actually do make the argument that what would it look like if most of your Apex classes were a bit general purpose, rather than saying one class for this and this class for exactly that? What if your classes were like internal APIs, right? Okay, we have a class for account management. There are different operations that can be executed for accounts. And there's another another class for cases or milestones. And so if your internal classes were some sort of internal APIs with general purpose methods that you can use to orchestrate different things, that increases modularity. And then you could use different Apex actions in a flow as a way to orchestrate different actions into a coherent flow. So great question. Do you recommend a setup to get the LLM to be grounded in AWAF principles? We're actually doing that at AutoRabbit, and I feel comfortable saying that because I'm the product manager of the product that I'm building. It's not something that we are launching yet, but we're experimenting with using LLMs that are prompted with a summary of the Apex well-architected framework, and then see how can we integrate that into a pull request process so that we can have like a bot, like an AutoRabbit bot, that automatically tells you, hey, this change doesn't follow this, and these principles from the AWAF. If you want to do something like that, then literally just go to the website, awaf.dev, and just copy the whole thing, throw it on ChatGPT or Claude, and just ask, hey, can you summarize this into bullet points, and then just give it to another prompt. What about PMD enforcement? Yeah, see, the thing is, PMD is great for certain things. I think, this is just my personal opinion, that a lot of stuff is going to change with AI in terms of static checks, just because the way PMD works and other tools. Even we have CodeScan, which is great product at AutoRabbit. But the way they work is they check static things. They have rules to check different things, and traditionally those are caught a bit late in the process. They're caught at the PR, right? And the PR is a good place to catch those things, but you could argue it's actually a bit too late. Like, what if you catch it exactly at the moment that you're writing the code? So one thing is CodeScan. Again, that AutoRabbit product, we actually have a VS Code extension that surfaces some of those things for you as you're writing code. And some of them may be based on PMD, some of them may be based on your own rules. And I think in the future, some of that stuff may be based on AI as well. So just generally, I think that space is going to change a little bit, and we're going to see less enforcement and more real-time feedback about the code that you're writing. There's a question there about, have I considered publishing prompts, rules, or anything to develop, I guess, against LLMs using AWAF? No, simply because I'm too busy. I have so many other things to do. So I would be happy for someone to do that. As I said, that the AWAF website is public, so anyone can access it, and I would be delighted to see community efforts around it. So I hope somebody takes that initiative. We have 3 minutes, so I need to just run quickly through the questions. Josh, is it okay if we spend a few more minutes, since there's a lot of questions there? Just waiting for Josh to reply to me here on Slack. Yeah, I can keep going. Okay, great. Hey, Custub, how do I manage environment variables? Yeah, regarding environment variables, it's a little bit off topic from AWAF, but I don't know, Custom, if you've seen the SFDX string replacements functionality. I actually mentioned it in a video that I did with Salesforce Bend last week. It's like a Salesforce SFDX native way of enforcing environment variables. It's not too easy to get it set up. I also know AutoRabbit, we have very good support for that. That is outside of the Salesforce DX space. Like, we have our own solution for kind of provisioning environments and having different values per environment. So I recommend you check that out. It's a question about, again, incorporating AWAF in a PR as a bot. That's what I said earlier that we're working on here at AutoRabbit. So I still don't know what the status of that is, because we're experimenting. There's a lot of moving parts on how to get it to work correctly, but I'm working on it. So hopefully I can have an update or some demo in a month or so. And then the last question is, how do you manage changes in orgs that are not metadata driven? Keep them in the repo, for example, on experience site. Great question. Unfortunately, the answer is that there's no good way of doing that. There's a lot of stuff that people do in production. And that is also something that I'm actually looking at for my product, Guard, at AutoRabbit, because that's kind of a compliance problem, right? If you have a bunch of changes that people are doing directly in production and they're never in the repo, then how do you know that they were even made? And so for our customers, which are in regulated industries, that's kind of a big deal. And so I'm thinking about that. It's in my list of things to think about for the product, right? How can we get changes that happen outside the pipeline and somehow bring them back? And there are some very easy ways to do it, but I'm thinking about how to do it correctly. Okay, so I think that was it. I don't know how many people are still here. I can't see the count, but thank you so much for those who stayed, and thank you so much for those who sent questions. I really, really appreciate that you stayed until the end. It's been 1 hour, so thank you so much. I did mention that we have a product called CodeScan, which does a lot of static code analysis plus some really cool stuff on Visual Studio Code. So there's going to be a CodeScan demo on August 12th. So just keep an eye for my LinkedIn profile or AutoRabbit's LinkedIn account. And we're going to post the details there on the CodeScan live demo. All right. And don't forget to get the book. Thank you so much, everyone. I had a great time and have a great day.